last year, I met Greg Schmidt, who is then a fourth-year fellow in general internal medicine at UBC, and he has a keen interest and eye for how health information systems ought to be designed to improve patient care and make it easier for users to enjoy their experience of the EMR, among other talents. But he has come to AMPATH, and he's in Eldoret now, working with us for the year as his during the 5th year of his fellowship, doing many things related to our project at AMPATH, but specifically one of the kind of key objectives for the first set of time that he's with us is to come up with a redesign for our UI. And so he's going to be presenting some initial work that he has done on that. So with that, I will turn it over to Greg.
Sounds good, thank you. Is this screen sharing working okay? Are you seeing a title slide right now?
Yep, we can see it.
All right, perfect. Let me know if the quality degrades, and I'll try switching my internet connection here. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I've been really lucky to spend my 5th year here in Eldoret. As JJ mentioned, I'm from Canada initially, and currently I'm in 5th year residency. And sometime around R1, I got quite obsessed with user interface design around electronic medical records, mostly probably because in Canada, at least, our systems aren't very good. And the more I started to look into this, I became obsessed with the visual display of quantitative information, which is a stream of scholarship around Edward Tuffy, who's a statistics professor at Yale. And he had actually written many decades ago in The Lancet a lot of excellent recommendations on how we could improve our visual display of information. And around 2nd year residency in general internal medicine, I got obsessed with the Bloomberg trading terminal. And I thought that this was the prototype, perfect example of a user interface for a general internist, because the data density on this machine, I think, exceeds anything that I've ever seen. And because of that, I actually built this concept EHR, some screenshots a few years ago, but the specifications that I was imagining was an enormous 27-inch monitor, or actually I was probably imagining 2 enormous 27-inch monitors. And here I am a few years later at AMPATH, and our requirements and specifications are a lot different. Most of our users operate on a tablet, about a 7 or an 8-inch tablet device. Some use a Chromebook, potentially some could use a phone. And we have a huge number of different types of users which are using our system. Everything from community health workers who may have never used a computer before and need a very, very straightforward, simple system to register patients, to input blood pressures. There's a number of our middle users who are nurses, allied health workers, clinical assistants, and clinical officers. They'll probably be on a tablet. Their workflow usually involves a certain amount of multitasking. There are forms that we use at AMPATH that lead a lot of the clinical care, but at times you may want to leave the form and review some labs or review some medications or a past note. And then you could imagine more super users. These are more likely the consultant clinicians, those who would be operating on a Chromebook or even a laptop or potentially a desktop with a monitor. And although they most often have a standardized workflow, there are times where you want to really delve into a patient's chart and try to go on that detective case to try to figure out what is causing the issue for a patient, and go through quite a lot of back data as you try to arrive at this conclusion. And we have, as I said, 3 very different use cases. And our challenge right now at AMPATH is that POC is very popular. And because of its popularity, more and more departments are wanting to use a point of care system. And that means that the system which we've built primarily for HIV workflows now needs to mold into chronic care workflows, to hypertension, to diabetes, to oncology, to acute care medicine, to neurology, to dermatology. And we're really looking at trying to come up with a system that we can implement across different types of departments, much closer to a full service EMR or EHR that we may think closer to that which you may find in North America. And that's kind of the focus of today's discussion. I'd like to do three things. First, derive from first principles a user interface design that is optimized for multitasking on mobile, tablet, and desktop. Then to identify, I think there's about 5 different ways we can sort and categorize medical data, and try to propose a single interface which can capture these different ways of looking at data, and then share some specific panel designs of an EHR. And part of the reason that JJ and I are interested in doing this and sharing this with the OpenMRS community is that we're looking for direction and feedback on the general interface framework. And then we can proceed to build a wireframe prototype, mostly of the interface, just to test the interactions, to test the screen flow. And assuming that that goes okay, then we could look into building the more panels and modules out in more detail. So if we were to start at the beginning on how do we create a multitasking, multi-device interface, I guess the first question is, are users using this in portrait and landscape mode? And when you look at portrait on the left and landscape on the right, the human eye, when trying to read data, prefers a portrait orientation. We like to view generally text in narrow columns and to have quite a lot of vertical space as we read. That actually mirrors essentially that of a newspaper column. And so increasing vertical height is a principle which we want to maximize. And this is especially important when you actually put the keyboard onto the interface, and you notice that if the user is using it in landscape mode, there's practically no usable vertical height. And so portrait mode, let's say, will be the default to go forward with. Then the question is, how do you split the screen? Well, there's 2 main ways. You can go down the middle or horizontal or vertical. There is a third way. You could potentially overlay a screen on top of the screen, but this has a few problems. 1, it covers up information below. 2, it's not standardized exactly where it appears. And 3, you end up having extra space between the area which is overlaid and the edge of the screen, which is essentially wasted area. And so let's not concentrate on that third option and really look at splitting your device between vertical and horizontal split screens. Here we see that those options spread across both portrait and landscape devices. And the device which provides the greatest vertical space is really this one here in the top upper left corner. You can see the landscape devices are really quite unusable as far as their vertical space. Now, what if we were to split this screen on a computer? Again, splitting it vertically is preferred. And also the reason which splitting it vertically is better on a computer is because you can tile 2 or 3 or 4 panels side by side. And you're working with a very similar panel structure now, both on your desktop as well as on your tablet, which means that we can have a similar design experience on both devices. Let's move to the third device, the phone. Well, if we split your phone screen in half, there's practically no ability to even read a single sentence. So that won't work on the left here. And what we really want to do is figure out a way to maximize multitasking on a phone. And there's a nice workaround. What you can do is you can take this general panel structure, which we see in green, and we can apply it right full screen onto your mobile phone. Then we can take the other panel, which let's say the green panel is the patient chart, like the notes, the medications, the record itself. And this pink or purple panel is more of the action panel, that which you write your note in and that which you make orders in. We can overlay it on top of the green panel as a bottom navigation bar. And you can pull this bar up halfway on the device to be able to multitask in both screens, or you can pull it all the way up to have a full screen interface and then recess it all the way down again. And this has become quite common, this bottom drawer navigation, or sorry, this bottom navigation drawer. And we see that on Google Maps as well as Apple Maps here. This is just an example of each. And so I guess just to summarize, what we can do is we can split the screen here down the center. The way in which we can operate this split screen as a user is by putting a button at the bottom of the screen. And you can just pull on that button to the left if you want to make the panel on the right full screen. For instance, your action or your ordering in your note panel. And you can make the left panel full screen as well if you want to review labs or medications or past documentation. And of course, you could always bring it back to the middle, which is also nice in this type of an arrangement because we can create very standardized modules in our interface design. And if the user is working in split screen mode, the width of this module is going to mirror approximately that which we need to design for on the phone. We can design the same panel arrangement for your desktop. We can do the same one on the tablet. And if the user happens to make either the left panel or the right panel full screen, we have the options to either create 2 columns of panels or to take a panel and extend it all the way. For instance, if we imagine a table that we wanted to extend to the right here. So this is a really versatile interface design here. And now we get to the question of where does the navigation bar go? Well, there's 2 main spots. You could put it on the side or you could put it on the top or the bottom. If we put it on the side though, the problem is that the amount of horizontal space that we have does become significantly reduced, especially on a 6 or a 7-inch tablet. The other difficulty with placing the navigation on the side on mobile is that the space, 44 pixels is only wide enough to hold an icon. This means that the user has to know what the specific menu icons are, or you have to open up the navigation panel to be able to read the text. The other trouble with left-sided navigation is it's not a common on websites, and so it may not translate as well to desktop. And it also isn't as common on phones. So if we assume we want to place the navigation bar either on the top or on the bottom, the question is, which is better? There has been certainly a trend in the last several years to place the primary navigation bar on the bottom. And I'm actually have been a huge fan of this. It's fortunate that Google's finally come around to it as well. But the main reason for this is that as devices have grown in size, your finger can't reach to the top of the screen. And therefore, by placing the navigation bar on the bottom, you can much quicker control and navigate through the app. The problem, though, comes if you need to have 2 levels of navigation. For instance, a second navigation bar, which is subservient to the first navigation bar. It's more intuitive on the example on your left that the top primary one and the second navigation bar is the secondary one. It becomes a little bit counterintuitive when this arrangement is flipped if these bars are placed on the bottom. And it becomes even more counterintuitive if we place a third navigation bar. For instance, a bar which is specific to the content being displayed on the screen. In this case, the example on the right, where we have actually the least important bar on the top and the most important bar on the bottom, I think could be confusing to users. It also isn't a standard way to design your interface on a desktop. Most desktop operations still use the example on the left, where the hierarchy is determined from top to bottom. And so because of this, the preference going forward will be to use this example on the left with the primary navigation bar at the top, a secondary navigation bar, the content in the middle, and then a detailed navigation bar in the bottom. And just as an example, these are some screenshots showing how far your thumb can naturally reach on a phone device, which is the green area. And then we run into the question of, if we put our primary navigation at the top of the screen, because it's more intuitive to place the hierarchy at the top, how do we control the app in a very quick and efficient manner? And fortunately, there's a really great workaround which some apps have started to use in the last few years. And I absolutely love this. Here we have Twitter, and you'll see that their primary navigation bar here is across the top. We've gone now in design style to essentially using text to describe the button rather than to use an icon from a lot of our buttons. And the way that the user can navigate this horizontal bar at the top of the screen is actually by swiping left and right in the content area of the main page. And this is really quick to be able to swipe left or to swipe right or up or down. I call this Cartesial navigation because you really can use just these 4 directions to control the app. If you want, you can still press the buttons at the top of the screen if you didn't know that you can swipe, or if your device doesn't tolerate it. Although Google Chrome now does support touch events, which would make this type of an interface possible, even in the native Chrome browser. Another example, here's the Kindle Fire here on the left. And you can see how quickly that you can flip through pages almost as effortless as a book. Or we have on the right, the exact same experience on the iPhone camera app. And so I've become a very big fan of this Cartesial navigation's ability to quickly and rapidly fire through pages with one thumb at a time. And we can apply this same principle to our device. One other thing to take into consideration is the way that they use horizontal navigation bars. The navigation bar extends over the edge of the screen, and the user is able to slide it left or right if it's off the screen. But as you go up in screen size, you're able to capture more of that navigation bar on the tablet, which we see now on the right. And this is a really good interface design because it scales all the way from a phone up to a desktop computer, and it works well at each of the 3 stages without having to dramatically change the interface. And here's that 3rd option with the bar across the top. And we're seeing increasing trend to using this horizontal sliding header in more and more applications. Google Chrome actually just updated, or Google just updated how they display this page under the image search, I think in the last week or so. And in the latest edition of Apple iOS, there's more and more horizontal sliders occurring within that operating system. So I think it's a good style to adopt, mostly because it works so well between screens of different sizes. If we want to summarize these first principles that we put together, we kind of have a primary heading, we have a secondary heading, which is controlled by swiping to the left or swiping to the right, and then we have a bar at the bottom. Now, because this isn't the late 90s, we'll fix these colors and clean this interface up a little bit, and there we go. And we'll also add a patient name to the interface here at the bar at the top, and that ends the part 1 here on how to create a multitasking interface that works on multiple devices. Maybe I'll pause here before we go into the next part, which is looking at ways which we can group clinical data together.
Thanks for showing that. And that's a really impressive demonstration and really interesting. And I mean, we're definitely a lot of people are transfixed to the screen here on our side. This is Mike from PIH.
Oh, cool.
Because we're looking at solving very similar problems with at the moment, and very eager to learn from what you guys have studied here.
Yeah, and this is Dave from PIH, and sort of a recent application that we started to design and build out. We actually like the first decision we made was to actually go in portrait mode. I mean, potentially because of our lack of imagination.
In landscape mode, you mean?
I'm sorry, landscape mode, I meant to say, probably because of our lack of imagination, but just because we wanted to work equally well on laptops as a tablet. So I don't know if, like I'm looking at what you're presenting, and I heard kind of what you said in the beginning about how it could translate to a laptop, but I am having a little bit of difficulty sort of imagining how some of these components would work equally well on a laptop with a what is essentially a landscape orientated screen.
I think the specific question sorry, this is Cosmin from PH. Because the reason we went in the landscape mode is because we have those list of patients with a lot of columns, and if we were going to go in a portrait mode, and then if we are to slide to left or right, this might actually overlap with the menu, because when you go, it's like you swipe left or right, you go to actually change the menu, as opposed in this case you want to just go to the right of the content.
Yes.
I think Dave, this is Mike again. I think Dave and Cosmin hit it on the head for us, and I think for me it was primarily I think it was more of a lack of imagination, in the sense that a tablet in landscape mode is the same orientation as a monitor would be if you weren't, if you had like a J2 or if you had a laptop or something like that, that you can just design with the same sort of proportions. I definitely I like these design principles you've come up with, and I see what you mean. I think this favors a mobile first approach, and I think if you are going to have particular users that are using like phones to access the system quite frequently, or if small tablets are going to be quite common, I can see why this is useful. I do think I'd be interested to see exactly in the details, how the specific content and the specific data collection forms and things like that scale, in this environment, and makes the system actually work well with the content we're collecting.
Certainly. I have some screenshots a bit later in the presentation to try to show some of that. You mentioned the trouble with having, as you say, if we try to swipe left and right as to control the menu, and then we run into the trouble of having a very wide table in the interface as well, that you may have overlapping or conflicting left-right instructions. My preference in that case would be that if the table exceeds the width of the mobile device, or the screen width, that the rows which are off the screen should start to stack. Meaning that if you have one row on a desktop, this might require stacking to 2 lines long on a tablet, and that card might become 3 or 4 lines long on a mobile device. And so each row in the table becomes a responsive panel almost, which adapts to the width of the device.
So I just want to be mindful of time. We could do a lot of debating on the details of layout.
I'll keep
so
moving.
Probably should keep you moving, because we're already halfway through the call.
Sure. So let's look at some ways to group clinical data.
One comment I would just say to folks is there is on the notes page, as he goes along and you have questions or ideas or things you want to talk about, feel free to climb on the notes page in Etherpad and throw those in.
Great, thank you.
Go ahead.
I came up with approximately 4 or 5 ways which I think we can group clinical data. And I'll start with source-orientated grouping. Now, I pulled the word source from Larry Weed, who was the godfather of the problem-oriented medical record. And he called it source because that's the origin of where the data comes from. The notes go in the notes tab, the labs go in the labs tab, the medications go in the medication tab, the imaging goes in the imaging tab. And in some ways, this is very good if you have a paper record, because each of these sources likely will be producing its own report on its own facts on its own paper. And so if you have a coil-bound book that you need to put this information into, you can create a separate tab for each of these. And this is really, for the most part, I think the most common way which we group medical information. And we, on electronic medical records, have just reproduced this paper tab system. Unfortunately, this was Larry Weed's, one of his big pet peeves is, why do we have in our record the x-ray of the head, he said, beside the x-ray of the knee? Are they related? probably related to the clinical issue the patient has, they aren't. It's more of just that they're related and that they originate from the same source. And so a second way which we could group clinical data would be by issue. When I say issue, I mean it could be, for instance, a diagnosis, or it could be a problem that we're treating, or it could even be a symptom such as cardiovascular or respiratory. And in this case, we can take all the data which is in its original sources and split it into its respective issue. And that way, when we open up diabetes, we can look at all the relevant notes, the medications, the labs, and the imaging around that issue. And from a clinical perspective, this probably makes more sense if we're able to closely correlate both the source and the issue together. In many ways, this is all kind of what medical residents or medical students do, is they go around and they collect this disparate data, which is in its original sources, bring it together into the issue, and then they can present it to the attending physician. One other way which we can group clinical data is by time. So in this case, the source data sorted by issue is grouped together. We may want to go in and actually resort these data points based on the clinical course that they occurred. And now you can read through this stack of paper from the top to the bottom, and you can get a very quick overview of the clinical course of that condition. It also makes it very easy that if your last appointment for hypertension was, let's say, imagine this blue line, and the patient comes in now here, you know exactly which pages you need to look through to fully catch yourself up on what's happened in between the patient's last visit and their current state. Now, you may want to group by time in the patient's chart as an overall view and have all the entire chart categorized based on time. And I actually think that this would be a really great tool which we could use in contemporary EHRs. In many ways, this is actually the most archaic and the most old form of displaying clinical data, where patient charts were essentially collections of clinical notes and ad hoc labs and tests, which were stacked up in the order that they arrived. And in many ways, it's also the best way to provide the clinical evolution of that patient's course. When we think about a summary, we may want to take this very long stack of data and provide just a snippet view, an overview of the entire patient's chart, where you can see what their issues are, you can see what notes they've had, which clinicians they've been to, what types of labs, what type of medications, and what type of tests are in that file. But then someone might come along and the patient might be going just to the HIV clinic, and you may want to pull out of this a summary of just the HIV conditions. And if you're seeing a patient in an HIV clinic, you may then find out that you should also manage their diabetes, and perhaps then you want to turn your attention to a summary of all the diabetes care. And this concept of summary is, I would like to use this idea of a data capsule, or this issue of issue-based data collection. What we can do is we can create a capsule called diabetes, for instance, and we can associate with that condition certain sets of labs, certain sets of clinical encounters and visit types. And we can know, for instance, that if the patient had, let's say, a COPD capsule, and then they happen to get an X-ray done for tuberculosis screening, that the COPD capsule should know that a chest X-ray is a diagnostic entity important to the issue, and then pull in the X-ray that was done for a different issue. So these capsules are almost self-updating, self-generating. They just need the general schema of what medications, labs, notes should be associated into the capsule. And in theory, if you came into a hospital and a physician looked at your diabetes capsule, they would look at the data within this capsule, make some changes, write some notes, and the changes to the medications and the changes to the notes would be associated with that diabetes capsule, which means that when the patient then returns to the outpatient environment and a clinician there wants to look into the patient's diabetic condition, they can know exactly what medications were changed and why those medications were changed, because the medications and the notes end up getting threaded in line into the capsule. I could talk about this later on, but it's not crucial for this conversation. But I think it could be a really useful way, as we'll see, to self-generate the user interface going forward. I'll comment on it a little bit later. The last way to group clinical data I call Bloodhound. Now, this is actually the most common way I think that, for instance, general internists might practice when they're trying to solve a case which is a little bit complicated or unclear. You may start with a clinical note, and then you may look through a few other clinical notes and come across a lab. And then, of course, you don't want to look just at that lab in of itself. You may go back to 2014 and find the white count is 1, the white blood cell count. And then you need to find the other white blood cell counts from the same time and compare the lab work across 2014. And then you may ask the patient, why do you remember why you were having blood work in 2014? Do you remember they were telling you your blood work was off? And usually the patient may not know, and they may tell you which physician they went to. And so you'll then go and try to find those clinical notes which were written at the same time as this isolated blood work that you found was produced. And then you'll find old clinical records, and they may lead you to the fact that bone marrow or another test was done. And then you may try to find the reports from that test and try to see what the hematologist, how they interpreted that previous bone marrow report. And then you keep going down this very path where you end up going both forward and backwards in time. You end up jumping from one source, such as notes, across to other sources, such as labs. And then once you get to a new source, you end up having to compare different files within the source that you've jumped to. And this is a very difficult workflow to try to replicate in the computer, because every time you go on one of these detective chases, your workflow is going to be very different. And you can't be bound by these categories of source, issue, time, or summary, because it's not a straight linear process that you go through. It's very much changing both between sources, between times, and between issues. But I think we can capture this type of a workflow in the EHR. So we'll just put it there as the last way. So here's all the different ways which I think we can group clinical data. And rather than building 7 separate user interfaces, or potentially even more interfaces, if we imagine building a separate interface for HIV and a separate interface for diabetes, let's just go build one interface that does everything. We're back here where we were a little bit earlier. And what we can do is we'll just expand it to full screen, and we'll take that source information, the notes, the medications, the labs, the imaging. I'm not too dogmatic on exactly what these tabs should be. Should physical exam be its own tab? Maybe. Or should physical exam go in notes? Do labs and imaging each need their own tab, or should there be one tab called tests? I think this is a good area for discussion, but I think there's a general concept that there's probably about half a dozen overarching buckets that we wanted to put at the highest level content into. And we can go ahead and put these buckets right there at that top heading, that really easy second heading, which we can swipe between. Now let's go and grab the next content, those different views where we want to either sort the medications to view all the medications, or we may want to view the medications which are specific for HIV or specific for diabetes. Well, we can actually do this very simply by placing this sort feature into the primary heading. So we'll put it into the primary heading there. And in this case, what we're looking at is we have the patient's chart. In theory, we'd have these tabs, notes, medications, tests, etc. And we're looking at the information for all of the patient's conditions. We could click on the filter to open up the top header, and we could change it to only show the HIV content. And right now, we've reconfigured the chart to essentially be an HIV shadow chart. I don't know if the term shadow chart is used here, but in Canada, sometimes individual departments will create their own chart. And it was called the shadow chart because they would only pull out the information they cared about, and then they kept it in their own medical record place in the hospital. Well, we can automatically create these shadow charts for any condition we want, just by selecting the issues. Or in theory, you could get very creative. We could come up with ways to sort information based off of system or based off of entrance complaint, such as shortness of breath. But to start, just simply having the system, the issues might be the easiest. We'll accept the HIV here, and now we have an HIV specific chart. One way which, rather than having to click on the filter manually to get back to, you could actually just swipe across this top header here. And by swiping, you can swipe through all the issues and it will reconfigure the user interface as you swipe left or right. Now, there's a few more information we want to discuss, and that's this auto-configuring aspect of it. One of the key things for us as a group here at AMPATH is being able to bring more organizations onto the EHR quickly. And if we adopt an interface such as this, where we configure the interface specifically around the program at the top, all we need to do to add new programs is essentially ask the program what medications they want to prioritize, what labs they want to prioritize, what imaging they want to prioritize. And we can put that content, for instance, into bold. When you are looking at medications in diabetes, you could put the diabetic medications in bold, or we could pull the diabetic medications to the top of the list. And the interface will auto-configure based on whatever program you put in. Or essentially, this could be done potentially like through a JSON schema or something to that effect, setting the parameters for what diabetes sets. And there's always the tension whenever you create view-specific electronic medical records that information will be siloed. If you only show the diabetes medications and you forget to show the other medications that they're on, you might end up having a complication. And so I think the way around this is that when we configure the interface to a specific condition, all we do is, as I mentioned, we pull the areas of interest either to a panel at the top, and then you can always view the other content below, or we simply place in bold the content of interest. For instance, we would put in bold all the notes which are related to diabetes, but you could still see that the patient has had many visits for other conditions. Moving along, there's still a few other source types of data we need to store. There's the concept of timeline, which we can add into our second header here, meaning that if we just swipe once to the left, you'll be able to have a complete timeline of all the content in that person's diabetes history. And we can treat summary the same way and just add it right here adjacent to timeline. Now, there's something we forgot, which is all the other information which is important about a patient, their family history, social history, social ability to pay, other information which may not be medically related. And we can put all that information in right beside it as well here. And now we've got a pretty comprehensive patient chart which we can jump through left to right by swiping pretty quickly. There's one other thing we should probably add in, which is a search feature. We can place that up there. And the search I haven't built out too much here, but the search will tie very closely to the patient timeline, because ultimately I think the timeline view or the summary view will probably be the default view that people would like to see when they open the chart. The timeline view makes a lot of sense from an outpatient clinic perspective. You kind of want to know exactly what's happened since you last saw the patient. And I suspect the search feature will closely allow you to filter that timeline more specific. For instance, you could view the information from a particular hospital or from a particular clinic, from a particular clinician. So that's the second part. I'm just conscious of time here, so we're going to move quickly through the last third part. maybe what I'll do is I'll just pause after the third part and we can discuss there, just in the interest of time. I want to present a few simple panel interface ideas, starting again with looking at this Twitter application. Notice how you can click on some content and it becomes full screen. And then you can click on, for instance, the header, and it takes you to a summary page about that content. You can click on the content in the middle, and it takes you to a middle page. And you can click on specific items, and it takes you to a very detailed view. This is, again, all with Cartesial navigation. You're able to jump left or right, up or down, without ever having to use the menu bars at the top or at the bottom of the app. And we can use the same interface idea as a way to standardize the many ways which you can display medical information. So if we imagine that there's a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary panel, meaning that when you open the medications, for instance, there is a summary panel, which would be your primary panel. This might show all the active medications a patient is on. If you were to then click on one of the medications, you get to the secondary panel, which is a summary of the history of that patient's metformin. And then you can click on a specific item in the summary panel, and you're taken to the third level. And the third level is the most detailed, and it has all the other information about the prescription. I think this is a general concept that we could probably apply to most of those categories we had put into the second header on the previous pages. Now, some categories probably only need 2 levels, a summary and a detailed view, and some may need 4 levels. But as a general principle, I think 3 seems to be a good working framework. And just to show how this could work, look on the app, you'd be in medications. We're currently looking at all the medications which are active. And you could click on metformin, then you could click on the most recent one, and now you're looking at the specific prescription. You could swipe to the left in order to go back a page, just like on Twitter, and now you're back at the main page. This same principle could be applied to lab investigations. There could be a summary page where we have an overview of the most recent lab tests. Potentially, you could change the view from a grid, for instance, to spark lines. I won't get into spark lines right now, but they're a really amazing way to visualize laboratory data. And then you could click on a specific test, such as the hemoglobin, and that would take you to that secondary summary view of just the individual test, and you could see the hemoglobin values. And then you could click on a particular test in that secondary view, and now you're at the third layer of detail. I didn't get the ability to build this out for all the other components, but it's very easy to imagine how you could have a similar workflow for imaging studies, for patient notes, even if it's something such as the patient's demographic history, where you have a summary view of the entire social history, demographic history, family history. Then you click onto a specific page of just the family history, and then you have a specific page where you can edit more details. Now, this seems a little bit overly simplified that we can just create one summary panel for medications or one summary panel for lab tests. And this one panel will satisfy everyone. And there's actually a nice way build more variation into the standardized workflow. And what you can do is you can adjust this panel either by view, or you can adjust the summary panel by the way it's sorted. And you can do this for everything. So in this case, for labs, you could view it as a grid, you could view it as a sparkline, or you could view it as a graph. You could sort the tests either by grouping it as tests, or you could group it by programs such as HIV, hypertension. You could sort it by the date drawn or the date reported. These panels are very much open for discussion, and I think could just expand with time as more preferences of different users becomes evident. But it allows us to capture incredible variation with ways people like to display data across these different fields. And rather than creating 30, 40, 50, 60 different modules to try to display information for each of these categories, we can have one summary view and allow users to either change the way you view the data or change the way you sort and group the data. And I think we would be able to satisfy most of the use requirements. Looking ahead, you could imagine the timeline view, which you can scroll through. A few of the objects may be horizontal scrolls as well, and that's okay. This is quite common on most applications, even those which allow you to swipe left and right, to have certain module components which have a horizontal scroll to them. But the timeline view is actually really cool, because if you were to pull it down, or actually one thing, you could expand it, so you never have to leave the timeline view in theory. You could read the entirety of a report right within the timeline. Or if you were to pull it down, you could go forward in time, meaning you could see the upcoming tests, the upcoming visits and procedures that are already booked from this single view. So I suspect that my favorite view probably will become this timeline view, because I think you can really get everything you need in the most efficient manner from it. Now, sometimes users may want to, when you have a paper chart, take specific sheets and spread them across your desk, and to try to put the story together. And this has been really hard to do on digital records, because there's really no way to bookmark information. And so you could add the ability to bookmark any piece of discrete data in the record, or to add it essentially to a playlist or to a bookmark favorite list. And this would allow a clinician to go through a record, extract several old clinical reports, several surgical reports, several lab tests, and put it together into a bundle of information which they can then sort through themselves. This next thing is kind of an experimental idea, and it's called a mini timeline. What it is at the bottom of your screen, you have a chronologic timeline related to the object you're looking at. So in this case, you're looking at a metformin prescription, which could be this box here. And in theory, you could see the exact clinical notes which occurred before that prescription was written, and then the lab tests and the other outpatient notes. And you could scrub left and right through this as a means to always have context whenever you're looking at something. So if you're looking at a random PSA value from 2012 and you want to know why on earth was this even done, you can just click right beside it to see you'd have the clinical note, even though you're still within the medication view. And this, as far as where there's precedent for this type of an interface, in iMessage, they have a similar bar with small icons that you can scrub left and right. And when you go to actually move that bar, it expands. And that allows you to put a little bit more detail and information into that area. Just wrapping up here, the last few slides, we haven't really talked about the action panel, or this panel on the right-hand side. The action panel is essentially needs to adapt to all the different clinical workflows in all the different types of clinics. And 3 or 4 major categories could be a start screen, home, a work page, which is your actual workflow, a specific panel if you need to place any orders which may have not been captured in your workflow, and then a checkout, or a final page where you sign off that you've completed your notes, that you've placed the orders. So an example, and this is very rudimentary for the home page, could be, you open a patient's chart. On one side, you see a timeline of all the information that's occurred since the last visit. And on the right side, you see the specific reasons that the patient is there. You could select that they're there for an HIV return visit, that they're going to see the nutritionist, that they're having their hypertension follow-up, that they're having the clinical reminders could be integrated into this. And by inputting this data, you configure the workflow. And then when you click Start Visit and you go to your workflow will now pre-populate based off of how you configure this on the home screen. The different users in the clinic will have their own workflow pages, and that you can go through whatever workflows are required. One thing which is important to point out is the workflow panel in the action pane configures the clinical chart. Meaning, if you're part of a workflow where you're in the HIV section, it will configure the panel on the left to sort it by HIV. And if you're getting to the part of the clinical workflow where you're entering the physical exam for a patient, it will configure the panel on the left to show you the past physical exams. And so these two panels actually can very much become synchronized and allow you to always see the relevant clinical information that you need based off of your workflow settings. And then finally, you could sign out of the chart. Last here, we've been looking at today just the patient chart, but you can imagine having a home button where you return to the ability to search for a patient. You're probably going to need to have a patient list, which could populate based off of the different users in a clinic. There's going to need to be more parts of the EHR, such as a panel where you can display clinical tools or data analytics to change your user preferences. And that's kind of a bit of an overview. And just to summarize, we looked at this principle of vertical height. We tried to create an interface which scales from a mobile device to a tablet to a computer. We looked at 5 or 6 different ways to sort information and try to come up with a single interface which allows the user to choose the way they want to display the information, and then look at information from a summary view all the way to a granular view. And then ultimately do this in an interface which is very quick to navigate using this Cartesian navigation and touch events on the Chrome browser. And there's some kind of experimental ideas about a mini timeline which allows you to always see the context of the information you're looking at, and some sort of a workflow action panel which configures the rest of the interface and really drives the clinical visit. So I think we're getting close to time, but thank you very much for your time this evening.
I'm going to just jump in quickly. I think you can see that towards the end, the third part, Greg has put in a lot of thoughts that I think he had to rush through relatively quickly. And so it may be appropriate to, if there's interest, to schedule a follow-up kind of to give him more time or to discuss at least what you've seen so far. Darius, I know you want to jump in. I think, Greg, are you available to stay online for a little longer? If
that's not a problem for me.
Yeah, sorry,
so
I have a hard stop in 1 minute. So I was just going to say, this is really interesting. I would love to think, like, I don't know how we go from here to potentially something actionable or what. So hopefully you guys are able to, like, I mean, it's a pretty complicated question of how something like a design like this, through getting worked on at AMPATH, could also get looked at in an OpenMRS reference application or somewhere else. So however I love the thought that's been put into this, and it sounds like there's some really cool insights here. And sadly, I have to run.
Thank you.
Do others want to stay on, or if people have to go, we understand it's obviously late in various people's time zones.
I'm happy to stay on. I would like to figure out if there's some actionable way or a way that we could include this in, one part of the ref app or the platform, and the floor is open, depending on, or maybe I should ask, are there members who would like to continue this conversation a little bit longer?
I mean, I certainly hear us at PIH, are very interested in this conversation, and I think there's a lot more we could talk about. I don't know whether we're going to get kicked out of the conference room that we're in now, but we're happy to stay on longer if people are able to and chat through it a little bit.
So, JJ, can you speak to kind of what your plans are, what AMPATH's plans are in terms of this?
Yeah, I mean, so essentially, we've been trying to think about how we can repurpose our app to be more to be able to support better kind of all the needs that we're having from non-HIV care. And I've seen bits and pieces of Greg's prototypes, but this is probably the most comprehensive view I've seen to date. He's only been working on this for about 2 months. I think Greg was waiting to get to a point where he felt like he was kind of at a final draft type version, that we would start exploring how we could take it apart and build it in pieces. My wonder for the community was, to me, this has always been a big problem between how does AMPATH kind of collaborate with others, which is that we have our own UI, and there's the reference application, and then there's Bomni, and I don't know if any of the current solutions really address everybody's needs, especially in the setting of moving to more kind of primary care based care systems. So the first thought was, if it seemed like there was interest amongst other groups going forward, we would revisit how we might take this apart and start building it. My dream scenario, by January of this year or so, we would begin development on the core pieces to start moving over.
You mean January next year?
Yeah, sorry, this upcoming year. But we don't know. I mean, this is like a work in progress right now. This is where I think we would like to get to. I think some things are going to be much easier in terms of what Greg has done so far. Some things are going to be easier to implement, others are not. And we just need to figure out what a path to getting to from where we are right now to a version 1.0 of the new UI.
A couple questions on my end, JJ, and thanks for this, guys. This is really amazing work. I just want to let you guys know that this is definitely blown me away in terms of what the time and thought you put into this. A couple quick things. One, I'd love to get a copy of whatever this presentation is so that I can go through it. We can go through it in more detail, show it to others that aren't here, and sort of evangelize on some of these things a little bit here. So if that's available, that would be appreciated.
Certainly.
The second thing is, I think we've found over the last few months, as we've been embarking on our own evolution of our thoughts, is user interface design is not easy. It's hard. And even just getting to this point where we can flesh out the right UI UX experience for the user and to try to get that some more detail around that with some additional workflows, some real life scenarios in a tool like this, I think that would go, it would be extremely valuable in just encouraging others to design their systems in a compatible and similar way, even if at the beginning maybe we're using slightly different technologies, or there's some amount of work towards the same sort of final end. And I'd say for us, even and I don't know what elements would go into that. I mean, if we can start with CSS, if we can start with some sort of framework agnostic, sort of template or something like that. I don't know exactly how that would work, but I know we're investing in React at PIH at the moment. I know a lot of the ref app team through Andela is also, they're React developers. I know you guys have been developing on Angular 4 historically. So that's something we're going to have to square at some point, I would imagine, if we're going to collaborate on something like this. But if we can at least collaborate on the sort of UI UX elements and some aspects of CSS and behaviors that might be independent of that, that would be super interesting. And we do have resources we can apply towards that.
I'm aware that if the community is moving towards React, then maybe we need to start figuring that out in terms of moving AMPATH from Angular to React. And I think we're willing to kind of have that discussion. I think it's almost to the point where given this presentation, there's many levels to kind of unpack, and we would really need to sit down and just maybe think about what does the kind of a pathway look like, and what can we get started on, and go from there. I hesitate to be more specific than that right now. I think what's been very obvious for me is that, you know, I do not have this skill set, expertise, or, to be perfectly honest, interest in coming up with like what Greg has done. And I imagine that that may be shared across other groups as well. And so, you know, for me, it was very opportune and like just extremely lucky that Greg was looking for an opportunity to kind of test out some of his ideas, that he was interested in coming to Kenya, and that, you know, we've gotten to this point now. And so now, you know, we want to figure out how to move this forward, and, you know, there's going to be some pain, and, you know, we might as well figure out what that is right away, and then see if we can come up with a work plan for the, you know, coming year to move forward.
Yeah.
So, as far as working on something like this, I think there's two very different levels. On one level, as you mentioned, there's a CSS and HTML prototype, which isn't connected to any actual real data or real backend, which I think needs to be developed at a very even skeleton level, just to see, you know, do the panels work? Does the touch events actually work as we imagine? Does it scale between a desktop and a mobile as we think it might? And that can kind of be done in an environment agnostic to the underlying React or Angular framework. And then on the other level, in the complete opposite manner, there's a question about how we're storing data and how we tag data. And if we're doing it in such a manner that we could aggregate all the medications or all the labs or all the imaging into a UX front end very quickly, and then filter and sort that. And so I think there's almost work at opposite ends, which potentially needs to be done before it could come together.
Yeah, I would agree. This is Burke. I would just say there's benefit in just having the same vocabulary, like having a shared vision of kind of where we could see kind of a UI headed, and if there's general buy-in in that approach, just even having a shared vocabulary of kind of where things fit together is a great benefit for the community. I think I think there is potential of going a step beyond that in terms of, as JJ used to say, you know, breaking things down into what's actionable. You know, could we actually, you know, push that to the point where, you know, PIH and AMPATH said, okay, well, we're both invested in this, and maybe there's enough momentum that we can, you know, turn the AMPATH crew from Angular to React development that might, you know, make things more real than just, you know, CSS and best wishes. But I think even having the construct and the vocabulary there, we can start talking about both how to design application as well as what data and what needs are. Because I mean, my head's swimming with the, you know, backing this, like when you're going to try to group things by, you know, for a specific issue, there's a lot of metadata, you know, tagging and stuff that needs to happen to actually, for example, say, here's all the meds related to this diagnosis. And you know, there's a lot that needs to be done to kind of sort through those things. And, you know, that's where I think, as I hear from JJ, it's like, well, this is the North Star. This is kind of where we want to head. Then we can start laying down what can we do today versus what do we need, you know, in the platform to start supporting in terms of how data are tagged, so that we can support the more, you know, some of the cooler features down the road. I would hope that the AMPATH team, and maybe including Greg, would have their calendars clear on the first week of December and be able to join the OpenMRS conference there, because I think there'd be a lot of interest in this there.
Definitely looking forward to it. One other thing which we didn't talk about today is offline capability. And we've been reading blog posts, which means we aren't actually too far into development. I'm trying to figure out how to get an offline first application. And there may be the opportunity, potentially with a front end redesign on our, to build in an offline first principles, but using service workers. And it has both the benefit of one, working offline, but the second benefit of these offline first approaches for application development is your app is much more responsive because you cache to the local device the anticipated data. And so you're essentially doing local device load whenever you render a page, and you get a much more snappy user interface. The offline projects, I think something which potentially, I don't know if there's interest in other sites and trying to work on something like that, but it's technically rather challenging. And if more people were interested in trying to approach that type of project together, we might have a better outcome as well.
Kind of to piggyback on that idea, but you know, Burke, I think that like you know, I don't know the history so well for how people have come up with the reference application, but in some ways I feel like the project is parallel between the data side and the UI side. And you know, this might be a time to kind of rethink about how to more closely align like what's happening on the back end to what's happening on the front end. You know, because you're right, like I think I take the same approach to you as Greg comes up with ideas, like I'm like wondering, you know, my first inclination is to be like, that's not possible. Like how are we going to do that? Because like I don't know how to get the data there fast enough to make this like a usable experience. And so there would be, this is not just a UI discussion. This has to be like, I mean, obviously you could cut out a lot of stuff that would not leverage kind of that way of thinking about linking, of how we link data together in terms of its display to users. But, you know, I think the power from this really comes in like rethinking like that question. So.
Yeah, I think that I'd agree with that, JJ. I mean, I think from this is Mike again. I mean, from PIH's perspective, I mean, I think that we did not do anywhere near this level of analysis and design before we started embarking on what we're currently working on, which is essentially a touchscreen-based app built from scratch to support a bunch of our clinical workflows in Malawi, and the hope to scale that to Liberia to be the foundation of their entire point-of-care system. And you know, I can look at this and see, you know, like this is going to spark a lot of discussion around like whether we're on the right track and how we might want to adapt and look at this approach as a foundation for where we want to go. That being said, like we have deliverables in a month's time, 2 months' time, 4 months' time to actually deliver systems. And so we're going to have to figure out how to actually take the work we've already started doing and roll it out and use it while still wanting to, you know, and then to be able to build on that so as not to, you know, reinvent the wheel yet another time. And so, I mean, I know this is still like, you know, a design stage for you, but this is very much reality for us at the moment. And so I think if there's things we can do in the short term to, you know, align our active software development with where we might think something like this could go, and if we think there's a real possibility for, you know, building something collaborative, then that's something that's of interest to us. But we are basically steaming full steam ahead right now.
No, we appreciate that. I mean, in a sense, we're doing the same thing. You know, from the way that I'm kind of thinking about this work is like, I know our UI isn't that good, you know, and so we could keep like doing small hacks to make it better, like add little things, but like I just didn't you know, nobody on our team comprehensively thought about this like as we did it. It's more just like we have pressure, we need to get something built, like let's just get something working and we'll go from there. I think this has to be more of like a strategic decision, which is to say like, you know, build out what you need for the next 6 months to make sure you meet your deliverables. And then, you know, hopefully all of us can get to this point where we know that like, as of X date, say June of next year, like we are shifting, and there will be some pain, you know, there's never not going to be pain.
Right, that sounds good. So I mean, I don't know if any of the artifacts that you've used as far as these presentations are concerned are sort of more ready or more sort of fleshed out than others, but I mean, we're happy to look at any of them and think about how we might, incorporate things in. I do think that the use of horizontal scrolling in particular, in order to work in portrait mode and remain compatible with, say, different devices is something that now seems obvious, but given how much I spent on my phone, but it wasn't obvious when we were thinking through this at the time for some reason, and so that's gonna be something we're gonna be looking at.
Yeah, I think horizontal scrolling for navigation is makes sense. I think it's the horizontal scrolling for content viewing that is still an anti-pattern.
Right.
Yep. I also think that, like, if there's kind of like the standard layout that he's presented of like where things go on the page, if we had some consensus over how the organization of those widgets, in addition to like how one navigates, I feel like that makes it easier for us to come together, because like when I think about our own app right now, we're a very like menu driven app, like with a sidebar and a top control bar, and like it doesn't at all jive with how the current reference application works, which is, I think, more tiled rather than menu driven. And so, maybe that's one place, but maybe what we could agree to do, Mike, is to like have a follow-up call, and at that time, like present ideas about, some initial steps. And I think Greg's already at least thought, and our next kind of step was to kind of break this down and see where we could go, but maybe that's an appropriate place. And we know you're on a timeline, and we can try and do it sooner than later if that's better.
Well, it's helpful to see the vision here. I mean, obviously, this whole vision wouldn't be implemented on day one. It's just knowing, if you want to add X, Y, Z, you would do it in this pattern. If you wanted to add Y, you would do it in this pattern. It would start out with something much more simple, I think.
Yeah.
But knowing together how you add additional features in, how you extend the capabilities or the views, how you build it, where you put the search. And I think the reality is, at least historically over the last several years, is there are lots of organizations that do go off and build their own apps. I mean, if you look at yourselves and us and Bomni and Esaud and all these other distributions out there, I mean, maybe that will not be the reality in the future, but I think I do agree that we can come up with a common language around design of this that could be really, really helpful.
Yeah, and but understand a lot of the driver that has driven people to create their own apps isn't just people needing to get their own thing done. It's also been the technologies have been settling over the last 5 years, and so
that's true, Burke. But I think we have.
I mean, when we had a UI that was JSPs, and everybody, there were the bad sides of it, but everybody was kind of using that same framework.
Yeah.
There was a lot more sharing possible, and that's where I think where I would remain optimistic is if we got everybody into at least the basic framework and vocabulary, how things fit together and how they can extend the app. I mean, we don't lock everybody into saying everybody has to use this app. We rather say, here's a framework where, if you need to add your page or your secondary view, or you want to have your own secondary navigation options, here's how we can do that in a way that we can play together. And I remain optimistic that if we get people using that same just basic framework that's extensible, we could have a lot more sharing and divided work instead of a lot of redundant work happening everywhere. So
no, I 100% agree with that. I think that the idea that there's a design out there that we can all, iterate on and sort of come to a common agreement that this is like a great aspirational way to move forward, whether this is it or some evolution of this, and then teams are working towards the
totally agree. And
I think it should be possible.
Go ahead.
Sorry, no, I was just saying, I think it should be possible if we agree on the common design, CSS, data model, and web services, to still teams be able to use React or Angular framework. I mean, implementation could be independent of the design.
Yep. Thank you. I just want to say thank you, Greg, for putting the work into this, sharing it. It's good to see you leaning on some familiar names in terms of folks that have you refer to. And anyway, it's great work. I think there is the potential for this to be a game changer for where we head as a community, and we'll share this. I'm hoping I have it recorded such that I can share it online via YouTube. If you could share your slides as well, and then I think, as JJ pointed out, I think starting to break down some of the components and saying, okay, here's this view, or this, get names to things so that we say, okay, here's the kind of the primary view for medications, or the secondary view for medications, where we start having names of these things, and we can start selecting, okay, let's do primary and secondary views of medications, and this grouping widget, let's tackle those first, or we could start to pick and choose an approach.
Exactly. Thank you. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, awesome.
So just before we go, I wanted to ask, is there an action item for me to follow this, or I just let it go with the flow, as it were?
I think right now, I think it would be the AMPATH team will do a little bit deeper dive in terms of starting to break it into components. We'll communicate that, and on talk, and we can schedule another design call as next step.
Okay.
One kind of just important thing is it would be nice to, this is recorded, and I really, it's very unusual to get a presentation like with this much depth about these ideas, and it would be quite wonderful if we could somehow encourage our colleagues within the community to watch this. Especially like people involved in the reference application, so Stephen and others, because we needed somebody to come along and put together a set of kind of comprehensive ideas that we could then use as a template, and hopefully this will meet people's requirements for that, and then we can move forward from there.
Yep, agreed. I'm really hoping that my screen recorder worked and I'll be able to get it on YouTube.
I was going to do a screen capture tomorrow so I could get a high resolution video of it to upload. So if that's of any help, I can share the link tomorrow for that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Great, thank you.
All right, thanks, folks. We will see you in cyberspace.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.